individuals and the chill that it's likely to send down the spine of anyone who's considering protesting?
First and foremost, I want to say on behalf of all Iranians in the Iranian diaspora and inside Iran, and Happy Nowruz to everybody who is watching this moment. It's as we are going through the absolute despair and loss of our wonderful sports personalities, as you have just mentioned, to execution. I am currently hearing the beautiful sound of dohol, of do 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 do. It's literally that sound of the welcoming of the spring as we are rolling into this new year through a rescue. We rolled into the Christian New Year of 2026 with the pain and despair of a revolution that had been prolonged for 47 years, ever since the formation of this brutalist regime. A brutalist regime that has
It's a
been
capital
an Islamic
crime,
force of
waging war
terrorism
against God.
around the international community.
Yeah, in
And as I am
Iran, that's
speaking to you
awful.
right now with
How
your
sad.
audience, with your wonderful
Well, that's what some are
audience,
asking, is if
who
he
are
was such
sacrificing their family members
well-known
to the
sports character,
restoration
at
of
least
90 million
surrounded by
Iranians.
people that should have known better, or not let him go do that, should have known the laws, told him that's not a good idea. I don't know. It said they were protesting, like war against. I have no idea. It's just sad. They get some of these young characters who have a large following to influence, to go and do things like that. Right. I mean, as opposed to protecting them from those things, they influence them, and that is really sad. Yeah, we came out here first time this year to come out on the roof. I know, there's been actually quite a few times we could have already, and we just haven't yet. Not to read anyways. Yeah, so we're going to come out and do some reading. Yeah, we're going to read more of the peacemakers who went to war. I can get this to sit up here. There, how's that? Is that going to hold? Looks like it. How's that? I can't see the screen really good, so it's okay. That's really nice, yes. Alright. Oh yes, you're right there, which he had to obey. Meanwhile, the Castilians were laying siege to Lisbon, and emboldened by weak resistance, made frequent raids upon the suburbs. Before long, Nuno received a royal order to go to Lisbon. Despite the wretched conditions, worse even than those at Porto Alegre, Nuno did not lose heart when he arrived and saw the apparent hopelessness of the situation. One night, with Peter Alphonse, his cousin, and a handful of gallants, they were only 30 on foot and 24 mounted, he made his way out of the gate of St. Catherine to set an ambush for the enemy. Taking their places near the bridge of Alcantara, the adventurers hid themselves. It was late August. The night air was heavy with the scent of mown hay. They were in enemy territory, and they feared lest the slightest noise, the neighing of a horse, the ring of spur or clank of armor, might betray them. The enemy arrived, coming, as Nuno had foreseen, to despoil the vineyards and orchards, to take some fruit for the Castilian ships in the harbor and the troops on land, and to ruin the rest and thus increase the effectiveness of their blockade of the city. As soon as the enemy's troops had sent their armed guards towards the city gate, and then scattered the others about without encumbrance of armor, despoiling the countryside, Nuno and his men pounced from their hiding places and cut the unarmed plunderers to pieces. Confused, the distant armed guard broke into flight. Nuno and his men had gathered together and were about to make their triumphant return to the city when they became aware that over 200 Castilians had suddenly disembarked from the Castilian ships anchored in the harbor. After the rout of their own soldiers learned from the guards, who had but gone for help when Nuno's men attacked, the Castilians had immediately disembarked troops to cut off the Portuguese retreat to the city. Nun Alvarez gave a shout to his men. They had to give battle even though so greatly outnumbered. There was no retreat. Some of his followers say that Nuno seemed to exult in these great odds. He spurred his horse on before all the others, trusting in God and conscious of the token of his queen that rested over his heart. Mindful of her promise made over 100 years before to St. Simon Stock and never broken. His lance lay on his right arm, and the prayer of battle rose to his lips. But the followers, dismayed by the superior numbers, unexpectedly turned and fled. Nun Alvarez rode alone against 200 men. Nuno had not galloped far when he realized that he was alone. He glanced over his shoulder and saw his followers running for cover, but he did not check his horse. "I will die if God so wills," he said, "but at least I shall not see the cowardice of the Portuguese." Within a moment he was in the midst of the Castilian forces, his lance splintered in his hands on the first mighty impact. He brandished his sword, striking right and left amid a rain of arrows and stones and against the thrust of hostile spears. It was to his advantage that he was mounted, armored, and so close to the troops that only a few could get near him at a time, and they had to be careful, lest their arrows or lances should wound their own men. Almost at the first clash of battle, the sound of Nuno's splintering lance over the din of Castilian shouts. Many of Nuno's followers came to their senses, and, filled with remorse and reckless abandon, they wheeled their horses and galloped to the fight. When they arrived, Nuno's horse had just fallen under him, and he had rolled over in the fall. Nuno's horsemen charged through the Castilians, and a Portuguese lance pierced a soldier who had lifted his sword to strike through Nuno's visor. Meanwhile, other Portuguese came from the city and attacked the Castilians from the rear. In a matter of moments, the Castilians were completely routed. The few who were not slain barely saved themselves by covering their retreat to the ships. Chapter 4. Lenora and Anderio. These wars, as we have said, were brought upon the country by Portugal itself through dissension with Castile. The situation was made critical by the lack of union within the nation and conditions in the royal court. At this hour, the person who would prove to be Portugal's greatest menace and one of Nuno's deadliest enemies was the man who had schemed this war. We want to burden our nation with as little Portuguese history as possible, because we are trying to present a single man rather than the history of a nation. However, Count Anderio and this war, which he helped to negotiate, are keys to all of the rest of Nuno's public life. John Ferdinando Anderio was a Frenchman who had come to Portugal when Nuno was just 9 years old. He was the male counterpart to Queen Leonora Tellez, and as beautiful as Leonora Tellez had become queen through intrigue, As the beautiful Lenore Tellus had become queen through intrigue, handsome John Anderio became Count of Count of Aram, O-U-R-E-M, of Aram. In the same way, he became the queen's lover. This terrible scandal between his wife and a handsome, unscrupulous outsider seemed patent to everyone but King Ferdinand, and when Anderio was accused of treachery to the crown and a plot to kill Ferdinand, the queen persuaded the king that Anderio was innocent. The matter was taken to the King of Spain, however, and whom King Ferdinand was really a subject, and Anderio was exiled to England. There is where matters rose to a crisis. There is where matters rose to a crisis. That's an interesting sentence. There is where matters rose to a crisis. It's just one sentence in the middle of the page. There is where matters rose to a crisis. Yeah, I could hear you. Anderio did not leave his scheming behind him when he sailed out of Lisbon on his exile. That was the one with Dr. Drew, yeah? Yeah, did you watch it? It was really good. I thought so. There were some really good key elements in there. Right, but can you see how for any commoner or just someone to be able to put that together without any guidance, right? You'd almost have to be aware and in one of those environments or positions or have already experienced to be able to recognize that. And then those people are able to maybe guide others and highlight things that can help them come to those understandings. And it's nothing about taking sides with anyone or seeing that someone, is good or bad, or telling the truth or lying or whatever it is. It's just about looking at what's being said and the facts, what are the issues and concerns, being able to discern what's imminent. Yeah, there's a lot of frivolous stuff. So, yeah, I agree with you. I'm glad you liked it. Yeah, no, I can hear you pretty good on that channel. It's pretty clear. You're welcome. Thank you. All right, let's see. There is where matters rose to a crisis. Anderio did not leave his scheming behind him. Ooh, the wind is picking up. Feels good. Anderio did not leave his scheming behind him when he sailed out of Lisbon on his exile. He had not been in England long when, on credentials obtained by Queen Leonora to the effect that he was a Portuguese ambassador to England, the wicked Count of Aram contracted a secret alliance between England and Portugal, engaging to help the English in a great war against Castile, in return for which England's Prince Edward, son of the Duke of Lancaster, was promised the hand of Infanta Beatrice, daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Leonora. This meant that one day, by succession, Prince Edward would be regent of Portugal. It was typical Anderio treachery. The Infanta Beatrice had already been promised to the Duke of Benevento in the Treaty of Valida in 1373, and Anderio knew that King Ferdinand had consumption, then a fatal disease. And Anderio knew that King Ferdinand had consumption, then a fatal disease, and he and Queen Leonora were to be married as soon as the king died and rule Portugal together. After the English had helped them free Portugal from Castile, Leonora Tellus was a spoiled woman, utterly selfish, recklessly dissatisfied, restless, godless, but who would suspect that so much beauty could cloak such ugliness? Certainly Ferdinand could not, despite all the evidence he had. Besides, his own record was not so clean. He had not transgressed every decency in making her his queen. Had he not transgressed every decency in making her his queen? But if there was anyone Lenora really loved, it was Andariel, who was as common as she, and clever, handsome, daring, accomplished. Besides these natural virtues, they had their treachery in common. Neither of them cared anything for Portugal as such. They cared only in life, in power, in the exciting danger of intrigue, and in each other. They had no scruples in the world, no sense of fidelity to a promise, no sense of obligation to any person or to any nation. So the beautiful Lenora and the handsome Andariel, like ugly characters in an ugly but unfortunately true fairy tale, made an impossible pledge to England that they might ultimately betray both England and Ferdinand. The English were deceived and made the pact. Of course, King Ferdinand, who thirsted for Portuguese independence, saw in this pact the fulfillment to his long desires. Before he died, with the help England could send him, an England that feared the rising power of Spain, Castile, he would achieve the independence of his country. In gratitude, he conferred special honors on Andariel and new grants of land, and could not sufficiently thank his treacherous wife. It was while Nuno was still in Lisbon that Ferdinand and Queen Leonora went down to the great port to meet Count Andariel, who arrived there from England in the company of the Duke of Lancaster and a squadron of at least 48 ships and 3,000 soldiers, infantry, and archers, all of whom reached Lisbon safely and disembarked. Andariel, the traitorous exile, returned as a hero. Now Ferdinand would show Castile that Portugal would be a free nation. As events developed, it seemed that the battle would be fought between the city of Badajoz, which was held by the Castilians, and Elvas, which was held by the Portuguese and English. Nuno was still in Lisbon when the English army had disembarked there and gone to prepare for the battle. He longed to go along, but his older brother, the Prior of Crete, who had been placed in charge of the city, refused permission. It was this same brother, Don Pedro Alvarez, who had blocked Nuno's duel with John of Ansouries and the 10 Castilians. Now, Don Peter, holding command among the forces in Lisbon, not only refused permission to Nuno, but he gave orders that the guards at all the gates of Lisbon were to be doubled, and that on no condition were Nuno and his men to be permitted to leave the city. Nuno had hoped to persuade his brother. Now the double guard at the gates of the city was a final answer. It was too much. Feeling that the king would need him, Nuno, whether with or without his entourage, we do not know, opened a way for himself at one of the gates, at the point of his lance. His bravery was so well known among the soldiery from the incident at the gate of St. Catherine that no one challenged him. In a matter of moments, he was galloping along the road to Elvas, where the king received him. Each hour of each day brought details that pointed to a very great battle. I didn't bring out my water. That's okay. The two... Oh! My bookmark. I got it. Okay, let's see. Where were we? Okay, each hour of every day brought details that pointed to a very great battle. The two hostile armies had come up to each other and were camped on opposite sides of the Caya River. Suddenly, to the bewilderment of King Ferdinand, the Castilians withdrew towards Badajoz. There was no battle. Hostilities were immediately abandoned, and a few days later a new treaty of peace was made. Had Andariel revealed his motives to the King of Castile? Or had the word gotten out that Ferdinand, who was the backbone of the revolt against Castile, should never have been on the battlefield because he was wasting away with tuberculosis, then a mortal disease, and that with his death? Portuguese independence would die at the hand of Andario. Ferdinand had hoped to establish Portuguese independence before his death, but with this sudden retreat, it now seemed impossible. He felt defeated. Back in Almeida, as death approached, the long-deluded and vacillating regent saw Leonora in her true colors. For all her beauty and poise and lavish living, she was a traitor, faithless to him. Her association with Andario had become more public than ever. If after his death she and Andario were married, it would be disastrous to Portugal. He foresaw, too, pretension to the throne by his younger brother, the Master de Aviz, whom he cordially hated. Seeing his own ruin, the wretched man decided to take everyone to ruin with him, the Samson shaking the columns in the temple of the Philistines. The sick king suddenly reopened negotiations with the King of Castile. He had made up his mind that the Infanta Beatrice, scarcely 12 years of age, would marry the King of Castile himself. Thus, with the King of Castile heir to the regency of Portugal, there would be no more Portugal. There would be no more opening for the scheming Andario. There would be no more throne for the Master de Aviz, his brother. During the first week of May, therefore, in 1383, when Nuno was 23 years of age and had already shown himself so ready to die for the independence of Portugal, the Infanta Beatrice left for Elvas, accompanied by Queen Leonora. The sick King Ferdinand could not make the trip. He had become unable to move. Meanwhile, the Castilian king was making his way to Badajoz to receive the Infanta as his bride. "He thinks to deprive me of a throne," said Leonora, "but I shall rule Castile too." Thus, while King Ferdinand was dying in Almada, Queen Leonora held a splendid court in Elvas. With a plan of her own, she awaited the visit of Don John I of Castile. She was then less than 35 years of age, in the full splendor of her regal sovereignty and of her beauty. Although she had been sent to Elvas with the Infanta to write her own defeat, she fully expected to win Don John to herself, even though he would marry her daughter. The King of Castile finally arrived. He rode at the head of a brilliant following, quite ready to receive the spouse that brought him to the dowry of Portugal. Leonora Tellus went to meet him with her pompous cortege. When he saw her, Don John descended gallantly from his throne to kiss the queen's gloved hand. Then he seized the bridle of the mule she was riding and accompanied her on foot between the two lines of the Portuguese. A murmur of admiration rose from every side at the passage of the sovereigns. Flashes of victory darted from Leonora's starry eyes. It was the 14th of May, 1383, the day of the wedding. Nuno and his brothers had been invited to this national suicide, and Nuno, above all, took it hard. He remembered so well those words of his father. "Some day, Nuno, there will be a great war for the independence of Portugal, and she will need her Sir Galahad." He remembered his promise to fight for his great lady in heaven, to free Portugal from a bondage of corrupt government, to show it the path to spiritual nobility through the example of virtuous chivalry. When Nuno arrived in the company of his brother, Ferdinand Pereira, he entered the magnificent tent in which the banquet was being held. 7 bishops were there, from each of the 2 kingdoms, with the gentry and the great dignitaries of 2 courts. At the sides of the royal board, which was raised upon a broad platform under a rich canopy, sprawled long rows of tables. The sovereigns and princes seated themselves according to rank. The others confusedly shoved for the remaining places. Don Nuno Alvarez Pereira and his brother Ferdinand, of Portugal's highest nobility, had no seats reserved for them. It was not a day for patriots. More angry than ever, Nuno and Ferdinand finally found places in the very back of the tent. From there they could see the place the Ferdinand and Dario had near the sovereigns, and they could see the many exchanges which took place between the King of Castile and the treacherous Leonora as the wine flowed more and more freely. Finally, unable to restrain himself any longer, Nuno whispered to Ferdinand, "We have nothing to do here. Let's go. But first, I intend to punish them." He got up impetuously, elbowing his way through the swarm of courtiers. He approached the banquet table. There, in the very face of the royal gathering, and in full view of everyone in the tent, in the hush that fell upon the most important gathering of the two kingdoms, Don Nuno seized one of the table legs, shook the table until it crashed to the ground, and plates and glasses, rich earthenware, and viands of all description, rattled and rolled after hastily retreating royally. Then, in the general paralysis of stupefaction, Nuno walked out calmly, as if he had done nothing at all. Stupefaction. That's a cool word. Put that on the crossword. What was the other one? Viands? Viands? Rich earthenware and viands? Viands of all description. So viands and stupefaction. As soon as Lady Lenora recovered from her shock, she flared with rage. Since Don John was the greater sovereign, however, she looked to him to avenge the insult. But the king, when he learned who the daring youth was, felt that some concession should be made, and only remarked coldly, "A man who could do this is capable of doing more." Later events certainly demonstrated the truth of his words. Feeling at least slightly avenged on the adulterous queen, on the despicable Andario, and on the Castilian king, Nun Alvarez sprang to his horse and set out for his home in the Minho. As he galloped along, his conscience pricked him for showing anger. But was it not just? He asked himself. Should not someone show that virtue is still alive in Portugal? Events of the future would also show that the example which Nuno set on May 14th in the grand banquet tent at Elvas was to have an effect on all the future of Portugal. Nuno was not the only person at that banquet who bewailed the betrayal of Portugal. There was Master Diavez, only 2 years older than Nuno, the younger brother of the dying Ferdinand, who, by the alliance made that day, was being deprived of any pretension to the throne. When Don Nuno Alvarez Pereira, a mere noble property holder in the kingdom, dared to throw the entire event into confusion by turning over the royal banquet table, the spirit of the Master Diavez flamed to a conviction that all was not lost. "Hope and wait," an inner voice said to him. "Hope and wait." In the hilarity of the wedding feast, the clamorous episode and the moody silence of the Master Diavez were soon forgotten. King John, in the union of the two crowns, saw the fruition of all his aspirations. Lady Lenora, on the other hand, saw that she could rely on her charms to dominate her royal son-in-law and bind the ambitious Andario more closely to herself than ever. In the effusion of the event, which outwardly seemed so sincere, each one was trying to turn to deceive the other. 3 days later, on the 17th of May, 1383, the nuptial blessing was given at Badajoz. The youthful Infanta, heiress to the crown of Portugal, after her 5th betrothal, had finally become a spouse, the Queen of Castile. Hope and wait. Hope and wait. Nuno's Word, Chapter 5. During the October following, Ferdinand died in Lisbon, friendless, unhappy. He was vested in the Franciscan habit and buried in the Church of St. Francis in Lisbon. On the little hill in front of the royal palace, through the streets of the city, heralds with blasts of trumpets were proclaiming Lady Beatrice the Queen of Portugal. The body of Don Ferdinand was entombed hastily because of rapid decomposition. When Leonora, as regent, then fixed the solemn obsequies for the 13th day after the king's death, and the word went into the most distant provinces that all might come to pay their respects. Naturally, among those to come were the Peter Alvarez, the head of the family, came from Crete. None Alvarez hastened from his possessions in the Minho, but foreboding some treachery, he led with him his rather large and well-armed escort. When Nuno appeared at the court, Lady Leonora protested that she had forgiven his burst of temper at the banquet, and that he should send his men away, but Nuno kept them near. After mentioning it several times, the queen shrugged her shoulders and pretended not to notice Nuno's companions. Events were hastening to a crisis. The people were in bad humor when Lady Leonora, under pretense of sickness, refused to follow the remains of the king while they were being carried to the grave. The discontent rose to a pitch in the city. Moreover, it happened that the King of Castile, violating all recent treaties, had a large body of soldiers in Portugal. Andario, too, whom the people despised as a foreigner who had wormed his way to power, had returned to the court from his country of Aram, and, more impudent than ever, fairly flaunted his shameful ascendancy over the mind of the widowed queen. What is to become of this miserable country? We'll pause there. I wonder how long this has been out.